great power comes great responsibility. And of course, we all know there's tremendous power in librarianship. And I have the opportunity to speak with three wonderful librarians today, talking about different things that are going on relating to accessibility and accessible content for libraries and universities. So before we get started, just going to jump in and do a real quick round. And because of the format, I'm going to actually say your name and then ask you to just give us your institution and a little bit about your responsibilities at that institution. So I'll begin with John Unsworth.
Hi, I'm a university librarian and professor of English at the University of Virginia. And I'm also the principal investigator of a Mellon-funded project called FRAME, Federating Repositories of Accessible Material for Education, that I'll be talking about later.
Yes, thank you, John. Trisha.
Hello, my name is Trisha Prevett, and I am an e-learning librarian at Southern New Hampshire University. I am directly embedded in the online part of the division, and I'm there to support faculty and staff as they work on our programs and integrating information literacy instruction, and also primarily using library resources in courses. And we've been heavily involved in trying to ensure equity of access to information, not only throughout the student's experience with researching, but also in that regard as experiencing course content that is also from the library.
Great, thank you. Jonathan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan Mclone. I'm a digital product design engineer and accessibility specialist at Michigan Publishing. I'm also a senior associate librarian at the University of Michigan Library. I work on accessibility initiatives as part of my role at Michigan Publishing around making University of Michigan Press content meet accessibility guidelines and requirements, and also do quite a bit of user experience and front-end design and development work for the Fulcrum platform. And excited to be here and chat with everyone.
That's great. Thanks to all of you for that. So we're going to start with a pretty basic question and give you guys, each of you, a chance to expand a little bit. I'm curious, because the answers I'm sure will be very different institution to institution. What was the key motivator or inspiration point that got your institution started on this accessibility journey and with the accessibility projects you discussed? So let's start with Trisha.
Sure. I can say for myself, I was previously head of reference services at SNHU. And the catalyst for me was really working with one of our blind students who was having a difficult time accessing our databases and conducting the research that they needed to do for their course. So having that, direct experience and listening to the screen reader, faltering, not, being able to help the user navigate successfully through the platforms, and also not being able to actually work with any of the content, whether it's a PDF or an Epub or so that was really the catalyst, with starting to understand what are the barriers that people with disabilities face, not only our blind users, but with any disability with accessing resources. Of course, it's part of, as a librarian, it's part of our the ALA's Code of Ethics to ensure equal access, in really looking at what equality of service and access to information actually means. And so delving into what our users were experiencing with the library, we started to see that it truly was not equal, and having conversations around what could we impact in our world in terms of providing signing contracts with vendors, for providing content in our courses as required course reading, in the research endeavors that faculty and staff and students were engaging in. How could we work to ensure that everyone could access the material that they need? And that sounds really lofty, but believe it or not, hopefully I'll be able to expand a little bit later about some of the things that we're working on. And I know that other libraries, across the nation and in the world are doing as well to try to start moving the needle forward with that, because it's true. Our resources do not provide equal access to everybody. Did Michael get kicked out? Looks like Jonathan, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'll so the question is, what was the catalyst to start focusing on accessibility, accessible content? And University of Michigan Press, we began working to make our ebooks meet accessibility guidelines and best practices back in 2015. And we did this by making our Epub our primary ebook format, trained staff on image description, required alt text from authors, and all of this momentum really started when a reader, a print disabled reader who's actually a disability studies scholar at Syracuse, sort of lamented on the lack of accessibility features in our disability studies ebooks, and the irony of that, and documented his experience and the difficulties he was having. So it started with a user, and it was an igniting moment for the press. Our director, Charles Watkinson, was in full support of our staff focusing on a sort of comprehensive initiative to make our ebooks more accessible. So that was the sort of igniting moment. And as we started working on it, since we've been doing this since 2015, there are lots of other reasons that have emerged that I think are important to point out. One of the first things that we recognized when we started working on this, and it was pointed out by our longtime acquisitions editor, Leanne Fields, that it's kind of become our mantra that making accessible content is just better bookmaking. So, for example, one of the things that we share with our authors is, alt text, and having that with your images is great, but it would actually be even better if you put the description of your image in the body of the text. And this in turn causes the author to then think about why they selected the image and do a better job of tying that image into their argument in their books. And then the full description of that image is in the body of the text, and all readers get to access this content. So it's just, better bookmaking from our perspective, and sort of in that vein is the encoding underneath of the Epub is just better. Following the guidelines, the Epub now is semantically encoded, and headings are marked as headings, and sections are indicated, and there's navigation tools, and block quotes are marked up as such. So all of these Epubs are now enhanced to work better with machines, and who knows what we'll be able to do in the future now that our Epubs are fully encoded and done to standards. So that's just a couple things. And the third thing I would just add is our work and why we do this. We found that our work motivates others. It motivates other academic publishers and university presses, and also, and most importantly, perhaps it influences the vendors that we work with to consider accessibility in their ebook production workflows, and to make those features available to other presses who want to work on that.
Great.
Thank you,
John.
Jonathan.
Yeah.
So over to John.
So like both Trisha and Jonathan, there is a specific kind of precipitating event involving a blind student. And for me, that was in 2014, I think, when I was university librarian and chief information officer at Brandeis University. And we had a blind student who took a lot of film courses, and particularly foreign films. And we had staff who were, AV support kind of staff, who were shot by shot describing these films for that student. And when I learned about how much work went into just remediating one of those films, my first thought, of course, was, well, I hope nobody does that twice. And at the time, I was chair of the Boston Library Consortium. And I went to that group and asked how many of them were involved in remediation services and supporting students with print disabilities. And out of 17 libraries, the answer was none. And yet it really seemed like a library problem to me, providing educational resources and sharing and describing and keeping track and discovering educational content. So in 2015, began this project with some support initially from the Institute for Museum and Library Services and with a co-PI, Laura Wood at Tufts University. And we went to the AHEAD conference, which we were discussing just before the session, and did kind of focus groups to try to figure out why sharing wasn't happening. And what we learned was that a significant part of the reason that these folks in disability service offices weren't sharing their remediated content with each other was legal misinformation provided them by mostly large commercial publishers. And so we did a write-up of the environmental scan at the end of the IMLS funded phase, and I'm dropping that URL for that into the chat. And then at the beginning of the Mellon funded phase of this work, which began about 3 years ago, we did, because of those sharing issues, we did a white paper on the intersection of civil rights and copyright, and what laws actually apply and which laws trump which other laws in this situation. Because we also found that it wasn't just the publishers, but also some particularly risk-averse university councils were also incorrect about the law, maybe just didn't have the expertise in disability rights, but they were getting bad information too. And we realized that if we were going to build a coalition of universities that was going to do this sharing, we were going to need to answer these questions up front. And it's a really good group of people who put that white paper together, and the ARL published it. And I recommend it to you if you're struggling with resistance to this on your campuses.
Okay, I'm back. Okay, good. Thank you for that round of answers. And that's a great setup. I'm going to jump in here now and introduce myself a bit and explain the connection between what Benetech does with each of these institutions, as well as hundreds of other institutions all around the world. So I'm Michael Johnson. I'm the Director of Content Partnerships at Benetech. Benetech is a 20-plus-year-old charity. We're a nonprofit. We are a technology company which uses technology for the social good. And our largest programs are around global literacy. So we are heavily involved as a tech company, getting publishers to publish, distributors to distribute, buyers to buy, and users to use fully accessible digital content. We have two main programs: Bookshare, which is a repository of 1 million titles in 5 different formats, so 5 million total books available. And everybody on this call has some interaction with Bookshare as well. John Unsworth is going to talk about Frame a little bit later, and Bookshare is certainly a part of that. We also have GCA. So GCA is Global Certified Accessible, and the GCA program was designed to help the publishers. Benetech has over 1,000 publishers around the world who are donating content into our Bookshare database. And a lot of those publishers have come to us and say, hey, we like donating, we like what you do, and we appreciate your mission. We need help understanding how, at our point of creation, at the born stage, how do we make these books not just born digital, which we've been doing for years or decades, but born accessible? So the Global Certified Accessible program works with publishers, including, I point vaguely, but although you can't see me, at John at University of Michigan Press, the world's first globally certified accessible publishing house, university publishing house. So thank you for that. We're already working with UVA and a host of others, which John Unsworth will go in on Frame. And then at Southern New Hampshire University, I've had the pleasure of being on campus there to address a wide variety of faculty and curriculum developers and things like that on the issues of accessibility, as well as I've learned a great deal from them, not just practically how the librarians work to get digital content into the hands of students, but also the front end piece where they're, and Trisha will speak to this more in detail later, where Southern New Hampshire University is very specific in its language towards the vendor community as to what is expected on initial content phase. And then when things are found to be out of accessibility parameters, what gets done there. So that's me, that's Benetech. That's 2.5 minutes to cover the work of 75 people around the world, millions of titles, tens of millions of downloads, thousands of publishers, et cetera. But that's the connection that I have and the honor I have to work with all three of these organizations. Not just today, but in these other projects that I've been talking about. So this may have come up when I temporarily was kicked off of the internet, but I'll re-ask the question, and if it was answered, just we can skip to the next question. Before I got kicked off, I just said, tell a little bit about your organization and some accessibility background. If we could go through, and John's Unsworth, you're exempt specifically because I'm going to come back to you about frame. So I'm just going to ask Jonathan and Trisha about what you consider to be the most major event or project on campus as it relates to accessibility. So Trisha.
I think I'm going to give two examples. One is what we've done in the past, and then something a little bit more recent that we're working on right now. So there, I would say in around 2015, 2016, there was a large university initiative towards EIT. So for us, that's a document that we have crafted for the library. We have crafted a document that Michael was talking about earlier that goes along with all of our contracts. And so we work alongside with procurement and with our legal office in putting in language surrounding accessibility and what standards that Southern New Hampshire University expects all of our contracted vendors to meet, such as WCAG. And it also, details things like what does SNHU consider to be a reasonable turnaround time for if we were to go to Michael and say, Michael, this content isn't working. We have a PDF that just frankly is terrible because PDF is terrible, and we need a better copy for that student or to go into that course to be used. And what can you do for us? So there's very specific language surrounding timetables, what is acceptable both on the university end for what we are going to ask for. Of course, it is content remediation, like I just mentioned, but it's also platform, right? So if we discover that there is a barrier to access for how the platform works, then we're also going to work with that vendor to identify it and what is an acceptable time frame for these issues to be explored and worked on together, right? It's not coming from a place of look, we are trying to show that you are not in compliance with ADA or with our contract that we have signed, entered this agreement in good faith together, but how can we work together to address some of these issues? So that's been a major piece of the work that specifically has happened in the library. That also those EIT addendums are also included in all of the other contracted services and providers that across campus. We've also worked on the accessibility of our website, right? Huge issue to understand that things are not accessible there. So that's been a large push. I would say what we have come up against recently is a lot of this work, besides that EIT group that initially looked across the university and identified some things that we could start working on, because it's a journey. It's not, you will not reach an end stage to say that we are completely fully accessible and we're not going to do anything else, right? That's not reality. But what we've found recently is that there's a lot of work happening in pockets at the university. So I represent the library. We're doing a lot of good work there. Obviously, our accessibility offices, both on campus and online, are doing a lot of good work. Folks in our IT department are doing good work there. So in order to bring people together, we've put together this accessibility council that represents different units across the organization that has membership, and really looking at how can we start to have more fruitful conversations with parts of the university that are a little bit resistant to understanding why accessibility is important. And we've identified, and I'm sure this is not a shock to anyone saying this, but culture. Culture is a huge part of that. People understanding why paying attention to accessibility is important, why what is ableism, and how does that play into either conscious or unconscious decisions that each of us make into making making the experience for people with disabilities not successful or positive. And so we've looked at really a culture change that has to happen. Can we start to examine each of our individual privileges and understand that disability is a social construct? We need to identify that people with disabilities are whole people. And so by saying, as an example, I can remember some staff in my library being like, well, we don't have to push so hard on the vendors because when someone needs an accommodation, they'll ask for it. No, that is ableism. And people shouldn't have to ask to be able to get what they need in terms of information resources at all, just period. So I think that's the thing that we're working on right now that I hope is going to have the biggest impact, because once people understand that accessibility and is a DEI issue, it's about equality and inclusion. So I think airing those things and understanding that we all have a part to play to work on that is, I think, where we're going to start to see even more change.
That's great. Thank you very much, Trisha. And thanks for all the hard work that you guys are doing on all those areas. So Jonathan, as I mentioned earlier, singing your praises that University of Michigan was the first university press in the world to get through the GCA. Why don't you give the audience a little bit of an understanding about the GCA process, why you wanted to do it, and go ahead and tell them. I'm not embarrassed. Just go ahead and tell them how it went.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, so the last couple of years, we've been focused on getting our publishing workflow certified by Benetech as an accessible publishing workflow. And yeah, it was, it's a huge honor to be the first university press doing that. I must acknowledge Jillian Downey, our production manager, and Stephanie Rosen, accessibility specialist at the library, and a lot of the folks in the production team at the press who were instrumental in having that, having us get to that point. It really was a team effort of everybody working with you guys. And Michael, you and Charles LaPierre as well helped us out quite a bit. But underlying the whole Benetech certification process, which started in 2019, we had spent a lot of time, auditing our existing EPUBs, finding, correcting gaps and trying to meet accessibility guidelines. And kind of like Trisha, I just wanted to make, connection. Like we created an accessibility working group at Michigan Publishing. It brought together staff from all areas in our publishing division and worked with Stephanie Rosen, accessibility specialist at the University of Michigan Library, to begin addressing not just our EPUB accessibility, but the other components of that. So communicating to our readers on our website about how to get accessible copies of books, which reading devices are the most accessible, or reading systems and work best with our EPUBs, creating an accessibility statement for the press, doing things like revamping our author guide. So this is a little guide that goes out to our authors once they're under contract with us for us to publish their book, with the requirements. That guide would then include requirements of having them deliver alt text to us, and then going out and developing resources to help the authors learn about describing images, which is not an easy task, especially in the humanities and social sciences, when you're thinking about things like paintings and images of ceramics and things like that. It can be quite difficult to create an equitable description of an image. So we had kind of laid the groundwork before jumping into the certification process with Benetech, and I think that it did take 2 years, and that process, it sort of looks like we submit an Epub to you, that to Michael and his team, that was representative of the content we produce. So we're mainly humanities and social sciences publisher, and we do about 80 titles a year. And so we we're careful about selecting a book that just wasn't super easy, that had complex aspects to it, lots of linking, lots of language shifts, which I'll probably talk about a little later when we talk about challenges here, and things like tables and other things you see commonly in scholarly monographs. So we would submit that. We'd get a sort of report back that told us what we did good and what we did bad on, and then we would have to adjust our workflow to not just fix that book, but all the other books that are coming out of that, our publishing workflow. And so we did that once, and then a second time, and then a third time, and then it was on the third time that we received the certification. And in each phase, a new issue was often highlighted. If we think about with tables, our tables were, can oftentimes be complex, and we weren't including column and row headers in our tables, which if you do things like that, it allows someone who's using assistive technology to then hear the row or the column head read out as they navigate through the table data itself. So important things that we hadn't fully considered or incorporated into our Epubs at that point. So currently, now that we've, the work obviously isn't done. Once you get the certification, we're still working on ensuring that we're continuing to follow the guidelines, the accessibility guidelines for Epubs, as well as ensuring, setting up a robust sort of quality assurance internal that includes accessibility checks on those books, so that we're making sure that we're meeting all of those requirements as books come out. The other thing that we're really focused on right now is accessibility metadata, and getting the metadata. So there's, in Epub format, there's all kinds of accessibility metadata inside of the book that describes what accessibility features are in the book, that gives a summary of the accessibility of that particular title, and lots of other things that I won't get in the details about. But we're working right now on getting that content or metadata out of the Epub and into distribution channels like Onyx feeds, so that when our Epubs go out, this accessibility metadata is available in other venues, as well as displaying that metadata on our product pages for the University of Michigan Press and in Fulcrum, so that when someone comes to the product or looks at the book on the Fulcrum platform, they know right away what accessibility features are. Like, is it screen reader friendly? Does it have descriptions of images and those sorts of things? So yeah, that's just a few of the things that we're focused on right now.
That's great, Jonathan. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you didn't just run screaming from the room when I asked you to describe the process. So I appreciate
Yeah.
appreciate all that. So now to John Unsworth. John, we've mentioned Frame very lightly a couple of times, and this is your first big spotlight chance to give the audience some understanding of what Frame is, how it's connected to UVA, the other universities involved, and things like that. So over to you, sir.
Once
John,
I
you're
unmute
muted. There you
myself,
go.
yep, things will be off and running. There's a URL for the project, and what you will see at that Virginia EDU URL is a working copy of the infrastructure that we're building. Although it looks from the front page as though you need a login, you only need a login to upload or download content. So you can use the search function that you see there, and searching for titles or ISBNs will show you where content comes from and what kinds of accessibility features it has if it's been remediated. So it'll also, that homepage also show you the universities and repositories that are participating, and we founded this project around the participation of some large repositories of machine readable text, because we figured that was a good place to start. So HathiTrust, the Internet Archive, and Bookshare are the three major content repositories so far. There is a fourth repository at Virginia called Emma, and that's a kind of hub for the federated search that you can do here across the holdings of those three repositories. And it's also the home for material that didn't originate with any of those three repositories. So in general, the way this works is access is for Disability Service Office or library staff only. It's not for end users. Someone who is searching for a text on behalf of a student with a documented disability will, we hope, find at least machine readable text of that here, and download that, remediate it, and re-upload it with some information about what's been done to it. When it's re-uploaded, if it came from one of those three repositories, it goes back to that repository. And like I said, if it didn't come from one of those sources, then it comes to rest in Emma. In the Frame project, we're asking for library partnership with the disability service offices in participating universities. I mentioned earlier some of the barriers to sharing on the legal side, but there's another important barrier to sharing, which is time and effort. These are small staffs serving entire university populations, and frankly, the additional effort of describing what you've done and then uploading it is significant. And so we're trying to enlist library partners to help with that part of it. For example, perhaps by batch uploading things at the end of the semester. Now, there's some work that only the person who's remediated the text can do, specifically describing the nature of the remediations. But we're trying to keep it to that so that there's no significant additional effort beyond that description, because we realize how overbooked these people are. One other thing I'll say is that the project has been premised on the notion that there is duplication of effort and that we should try to reduce that. And along the way, we've come across information from, particularly from the Blackboard Ally product, which assesses accessibility on material uploaded to learning management systems. It doesn't hold the material, but it does keep track of some bibliographic information about what's being uploaded. And only about 1/3 of the millions of documents that are uploaded to learning management systems across the United States each year are unique, which means that 2/3 are not, which means there is a significant duplication of effort to be addressed. So at least that tells us we're on the right track. We will be opening this to broader participation in the coming year, and I'd invite you to drop me a line if you're interested in being on a mailing list. However, we will let people know as that prospect develops. I do not expect to ask libraries to pay for this. I'll just say that to this group. I think there is a real cost benefit case to be made for universities about participating in this, and there is some cost to keeping this kind of infrastructure going. But I actually think we're going to be talking first to usually it's a VP over student services of all kinds at universities, and I think that's probably where the responsibility for financially supporting this should end up, but we'll see.
Well, that was a great round of answers of the what's and the hows and things like that as it relates to all this content. And it occurs to me that because the four of us are very used to these topics, very used to these phrases, these abbreviations, and all these various things, perhaps I should jump in and give the audience just a bit of an understanding of what we're talking about and expand off something that Trisha said. You know, Trisha talked about hopefully just a single person. Hopefully it was corrected after the conversation of, hey, we don't need to do this because if people have this need, they'll self-diagnose and self-present and they'll tell us that they need it. Well, that's absolutely untrue. It's an understandable piece of fiction, but fiction nevertheless, right? The reality is there are enormous populations of people with print disabilities that do not announce, do not let you know, and they're struggling or suffering or dropping out because they can't get the content. Now, some of them wield the mighty pen of lawsuits, and I see my university friends cringing when I say that, but you know, there have been many, many lawsuits all across the country, universities, counties, cities, states, and they always lose because the American with Disabilities Act, which is 30 plus years old, makes it pretty clear that you can't do those things. And there's also educational law around basically denying fair and equal access to everybody. So there's that point, right? But I just give you a couple of hopefully easily rememberable items so you get some kind of scope as to what the population is, right? There are more blind people in the world than there are people with red hair, okay? Now I'm looking at a guy with red hair right now, so, you know, but that's just something to give you a little piece of understanding. Now, it's not just blind people who have print disabilities. There was a nice paper by Yale a little while ago, and their research says 20% of the population has dyslexia. So a lot of dyslexic students might not even know they have dyslexia, and they certainly, many of them won't self-identify. So the professor can sit in the front of the room or in front of the Zoom, whatever you're doing, or the librarian can, or anybody else can, and just look around, and you see people, right? And you don't know whether they have a print disability or not, whether it's cognitive, muscular, skeletal, whatever it happens to be. Trisha just dropped something in the chat about a real life example on this exact topic. So understand that more blind people than redheaded people in the world, more people with dyslexia than are left-handed. So these are enormous populations. Now, if you see somebody with a cane and a guide dog, you can make a reasonable assumption that they're blind. But if you see somebody with dyslexia, how do you know? If you see somebody with some other muscle tracking problem in their eyes or whatever, you just don't know. And we all have an obligation, morally, socially, but also legally, to make sure we're doing all that we can so that all students of all abilities can have access to all of the content. So enough from me about that. So just wanted to give you guys some scope because the four of us are in this all day, every day, and the rest of the audience very well may not be. So we touched a little bit on some challenges, and Trisha, you can declare yourself exempt if you want. You did mention a challenge before, but if you have other challenges you want to share, go right ahead. So I'll go to you first, and you can say, no, I'm good. Or if you have a new challenge, you can share it.
Yeah, I can keep it short. I would just say that I think having the mindset that, well, I'm one person, what can I really do about this? Or, you know, my library doesn't have that far of a reach, or, you know, my university really doesn't want to hear about, you know, or fund, you know, any initiatives that would address accessibility. What I would say to you is you can start small. Even if you are the one person, having been myself the one person that was raising her hand and waving and doing you know, mad things to make people listen to me about why this was important several years ago, there are groups of people, there are groups of librarians, you know, which you are hearing from today, you know, Michael at Benetech, I know the University of Michigan, the Big Ten Alliance. There are groups of people that are doing things, and you have access to them. So if you're not sure where to start, or that you have, hopefully we have kindled that fire for all of you to understand about why this is important and how we can work on it together, both as librarians and vendors and publishers. There are resources that you can utilize to get started on that, and to start to change the viewpoint of that this is not an issue, or it's only an issue if you're the one that has a disability.
I don't know if I'm happy or sad that you had more challenges, but I appreciate the feedback. So thank you for that. Jonathan, you talked about very specifically the process that the press went through to get certified, and there are challenges in that process. We don't do them deliberately to make it challenging, but we're trying to accomplish a very particular thing, which is to aid the publisher to do this work properly. Again, you can just say, I'm good, I've talked enough about challenges, but if you have another specific challenge you want to throw out that you run into, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just to publishers who are, considering making their content more accessible, one of the challenges you're going to encounter is, there's no way to stop your publishing, revamp your entire accessibility workflow, and then start publishing again once you know that you can make all of your content born accessible. So a real challenge there is just, it's like trying to change the tires on a car while it's moving. So the approach we really took was to break things up, almost like and take small incremental iterative steps to get us to where we needed to be over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. So just as an example, when we first started our initiative, we started with just focusing on our disability studies titles. We only did about 8 or less of those in a calendar year. So we've started focusing on making those as accessible as we could, requiring the alt text and learning from that and developing the resources for that. And by spring 2019, we were ready to say, yeah, all of our titles will include alt text and have more accessibility features. And then by January of 2021 is when we got the Benetech certification to really say, all of our titles that we put out there will not only have alt text, but will meet accessibility guidelines and WCAG AA. So it really is important to not fret over the sort of looming larger problem of how am I going to make all of our content accessible, but to just start working and make small incremental changes when you can.
That's great. Thanks, Jonathan. Now, John, you get a double pass, but you get one pass because you talked about frame and the effort of constituting it. And then you also shared some great links about the information/misinformation that's out there about what's legally allowable. So you can exercise either or both of your double passes and not answer any further. But if you have another challenge you want to share, that's okay too. Whatever's up, whatever you like. You're muted.
That's clearly my greatest challenge. Jonathan mentioned the accessibility metadata that's in the Epub standard, and that's very important. But one challenge that we've had is that there doesn't seem to exist additional metadata to describe the human remediation of a text that didn't start as an EPUB and didn't start as a remediated text or an accessible text. And so developing that additional metadata is something we've been spending a fair amount of time on in the project, and in the next year we'll be taking that to a working group at NISO to try to get it on track to become a broader standard.
Okay, that's great. In our closing couple of minutes, I'll ask you, we'll just go in reverse, starting with John Unsworth, just words of encouragement or wisdom that you'd like to share. We gave a lot of people a lot to think about. So what words of encouragement or wisdom do you wish to share with the audience about how to move forward?
Well, I would just say libraries have some strengths and some abilities that could be really important here. And I know at this point, probably many of you are engaged in accessibility efforts, but I'd encourage you to get to know the people in your disability service office if you don't already, and start to build a relationship there, because together you can really help students more than separately.
Jonathan?
Yeah, you know, I would say to the publishers, if you're a publisher and you're already producing EPUBs, hey, that's great. You're moving in the right direction, and you're probably further along than you really think you think you are. And so start with an audit of your EPUBs that you're producing yourself, you know, and find the gaps between what you're producing and the accessibility standards and guidelines. There's tools out there like the ACE accessibility checker that you can run your EPUBs through that will give you a good starting point, at least of some of the things that you might be missing in your EPUBs. But I think if you're already doing EPUBs, you're already a lot further along. So.
And bring us home, Trisha.
Yeah, I'll just, echo a lot of the other sentiments that we've heard so far today, that get started, start small. You have resources and people to support you. I'm going to drop the link to the Big Ten Alliance and also the ACRL Universal Accessibility Interest Group. I know that, when I first started trying to learn more about accessibility, that I found it kind of insulating, that it felt harder than it needed to be to find people who were doing this work, to find organizations that, could really help me to understand, like, where are we right now? What are the issues at hand? What can I do from the seat in my organization? And then being involved in professional organizations and, things like this. So I would say that stuff does exist. And I'm going to drop those two links. I found both of these groups to be really invaluable. And there's more out there. So just get started.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you. We're going to open it up for questions now. There are two ways you can drop a question in the chat, or you can do a question in the platform. So fire away with any questions. As we're waiting for the technology to catch up, I did want to ask Jonathan, how involved is the library itself in buying or procurement procedures around buying accessible content from other vendors that aren't the Michigan Press?
I'm not necessarily totally plugged into that process, but I do know that they have, much more, as most libraries are now, requiring things like VPATs and from vendors before they go into agreements, and pushing them to make accessibility improvements, not only to the content, but to the platforms that they're serving the content on, and ensuring that they're accessible. But I think a lot of that, there's been work in the BTAA around the types of language and things that can be put into contracts to require accessibility of their content, that it meets a certain standard. And from the press end, as we work and sell the University of Michigan ebook collection and other things that we're putting on Fulcrum, we hear quite a lot from librarians who are concerned and want to know about the accessibility of the content before they purchase anything.
That's great. Well, at University of Michigan and at Southern New Hampshire as well, and perhaps at University of Virginia, I'll give John a chance to answer in a second. This is a tool, which I prefer to say is a hammer, that the librarian community can really swing to move all this forward faster. If you tell your publishers, we will not buy content that's not certified accessible, or we prefer or give preference to content which is certified accessible, then that's going to drive publisher behavior, just like anybody buying anything drives behavior of the person producing that thing, right? And you can write these things into your contracts. There's work going on in different places. And you should also speak with your platform, the folks in the middle, right? So you have EBSCO and ProQuest, both of whom are partners with Benetech, and they're working very hard to make all of their systems as accessible as possible. And they're trying to work with the publishers they represent to get content. But the voices of the audience in this room are 1,000 times louder than my voice talking to these various people, because Benetech doesn't buy anything. We're a charity, we don't have any money. 2, we're not an educational institution. So the universities themselves expressing buying preferences for accessible only or preference for accessible first content makes a huge difference. So even if you're not doing something on campus about accessibility, you can, in your buying procedures and protocols, advance the accessibility cause by asking those questions. So John Unsworth, did you want to, questions are starting to come. So I'm just going to let you answer real quick, John. Does the Frame project have platform interaction with the EBSCOs and ProQuest and Elsevier's of the world?
No.
No. Okay.
No.
There we go. Simple. All right. So here we have a question in the chat, right? A very specific question, but has anyone found an accessible EPUB solution for side-by-side text translations?
I could maybe address that. Not yet. I mean, well, I don't know of any quite so right now, but we actually have a project we're working on right now that it involves side-by-side text translations for Lever Press, and we're trying to figure that out. So it's challenging because you have to do you potentially have to make it. This is maybe getting in too much of EPUB terminology, a fixed width or fixed layout EPUB, which can make it a little more challenging for screen readers. So you have the main language and then the translation on the other side, and that so that they display and scroll together. But hopefully we'll have that figured out, and I can share with Maya about how to do that in an accessible way. That title is supposed to publish in the spring of next year.
Well, I can echo Jonathan's response that while the standards do give relatively clear guidance on it, pulling it off is sort of a miracle, because you have to handle both the layout piece and the language shift piece. So there's a lot going on. The entire standards community is also looking at this. There's a particular work group, both inside of the book industry study group and at the W3C, about fixed layout and how to solve some of these issues. So it's a great question. Those were honest answers, which is we're not there yet and we're working on it. All right. Any other questions from the chat, or does our moderator? Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. And she may be in touch. Yeah, it's Jonathan and I have had lots of fun talking about language shifts, so I'm sure we're going to have a lot more fun talking about the side-by-side. It's a great question because it shows that somebody's already thinking about how is this going to impact what I'm doing in my job, in my library, my readers, my students. So that's fantastic, and keep sending those. There are a lot of groups that are trying to solve this issue. We found in GCA that there are a lot of children's publishers, which is almost all in fixed layout, which is by definition not accessible because you have to be able to reflow. So we're working on solving that problem from that end as well as from the academic end. Were the links that Trisha mentioned in this chat or the Zoom chat? So they're in the Zoom chat. Thank you, Neil, for that question. And having multiple platforms to monitor is a bit of extra excitement for all of us. So I appreciate that question.
Sandra, maybe you could copy and paste them into the Pathable for us.
Yes, the all-powerful Sandra can do anything. There you go. I will do that. See, it's like having a genie or something. Okay. Speechify is a great audio tool for importing course materials from Canvas to read PDFs aloud. So reading PDFs aloud, that's a good step. And we always say in the accessibility game, look, if you're doing anything, hooray and thank you, right? So the challenge with PDFs is they are inherently inaccessible. And while Speechify and there are other tools which may be able to read them aloud, the problem with that is the navigation for the reader is basically zero, right? So if the reader wants to go back and forth to pages and things like that, it doesn't work the same way as if a properly laid out EPUB file, so that the assistive technology gives the reader the complete control of what's happening rather than an audio stream. Okay, somebody says they agreed on PDF, but I don't know if they agreed on the part that I said it's inherently inaccessible, or if they agreed on the Speechify part. But I'm not a PDF basher. I don't think anybody on the panel is a PDF basher. It serves a very specific purpose. It does what it was designed to do, which is to take a picture of the page. And guess what? Blind people can't see pictures. So, it just doesn't work. Okay, so this from Trisha. We have Read Speaker in Brightspace, and it's a nice feature, but it doesn't solve the larger issue, right? So it's the same kind of thing. There are a lot of tools that can read stuff to you. What we're trying to do here with born accessible, fully accessible, and certainly GCA certified accessible content is let the reader have control of their own reading experience, just like your quote unquote traditional reader can do with a quote unquote traditional book. And so any of these other patches, any of these other plugs, we applaud them. We're glad people are doing that. We thank the good people at Desire to Learn for putting that into Brightspace. But this is about equity, right? It's not about separate but equal. It's about true equity. And so if you go with the EPUB and your EPUB is fully accessible, the reader, as I said, has the real opportunity to control their own reading and learning experience. And that's what we're all about. So I think we have time for one more question, if there's another question.
Well, Michael, while we're waiting, I'm just going to jump in and say something I haven't said yet, which is what an important partner Benetech's been in the Frame project, and a key technology partner in particular. Really, this infrastructure has been jointly built between UVA and Benetech, and your folks have been great to work with throughout the project. So, and there's some exciting technology coming down the pike from Benetech too. So great all around.
That's very kind of you, John. We appreciate those comments, as well as all that the University of Virginia has done, not the least of which you being PI on the whole project, which takes a whole load off of our plate. So it's been a great partnership, and all of us are looking forward to what we hope to be an expansion of the project, more universities, more content, more readers benefiting. Okay, now we have another question here, which will be our final one. Most of the top 4 publishers offer EPUB and PDF for perpetually or continuing access licensed directly for ebook purchases, I believe. SN and Taylor and Francis do, I believe. So that will take way longer than the 90 seconds we have, and that's an excellent point. So thank you for that. You're going to find a continued evolution of ebook sales, licensing, distribution, usage models going on. Forget about accessibility, just in general. If you read any of the Against the Grain stuff, there were a lot of articles about that, and it's going to keep happening. Taylor and Francis is already in the GCA program. Springer Nature's not yet, but we're having positive conversations. So that's a good point. The EPUBs will be accessible and the PDFs will not. So we are up against time. So this leaves me to thank Jonathan, Trisha, and John, as well as the all-powerful Sandra, for making this a success today. And of course, thanks the audience, because if there's nobody to talk to, there's no point in us talking. So thank you very much for that. And everybody have a great conference. Take care. Bye-bye.